from the connection standpoint, so much comes down to connection with humans, whether it be your employees or people that you might be doing business with, or potential customers. It really is all about relationships and connection. And I'll tell everyone, first thing you got to do is follow your people on Instagram. They're like, I'm not following my these young kids on Instagram that work for me. That feels awkward. I was like, well, then you got to work in that relationship, because they're not going to stick around for you if they don't feel like there's some sort of real connection. And it's not for them to follow you. So don't worry about what you're posting. It's for you to take a vested interest in their life.
Heroes are an inspiring group of people. Every one of them, from the larger-than-life comic book heroes you see on the big silver screen to the everyday heroes that let us live the privileged lives we do. Every hero has a story to tell. The doctor saving lives at your local hospital, the war veteran down the street who risked his lives for our freedom, the police officers and firefighters who risk their safety to ensure ours. Every hero is special and every story worth telling, but there is one class of heroes that I think is often ignored. The entrepreneur, the creator, the producer, the ones who look at the problems in this world and think to themselves, you know what, I can fix that, I can help people, and I can make a difference. Then they go out and do exactly that by creating a new product or introducing a new service. Some go on to change the world, others make a world of difference to their customers. Welcome to The Hero Show. Join us as we pull back the masks of the world's finest heropreneurs and learn the secrets to their powers, their success, and their influence, so you can use those secrets to attract more sales, make more money, and experience more freedom in your business. I'm your host, Richard Matthews, and we are on in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to The Hero Show. My name is Richard Matthews. I am live on the line today with Chris Tuff. Chris, are you there?
I'm here.
Awesome. So for those of you who don't know who Chris is the author of USA Today bestseller, The Millennial Whisperer. In his book, Chris offers research-based, time-tested strategies for bridging communication gaps between millennials and the rest of the workforce. With millennials on track to make up 75% of the workforce by 2030, it's crucial for employers to harness the strengths of this generation, help develop strong leaders for future generations. And you debunk myths about millennials while providing an in-depth look at generational stereotypes that do tend to be true. And I know in the book you share practical, real-world tested solutions to better understand millennials and effectively recruit, retain, and motivate this passionate generation. So with that introduction, what I want to talk to you about first is, what is it that you're known for? Why do people come to you? What is it that you actually help people with?
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up, because I start a lot of my conversations around that being your currency, right? And my currency, it's been a big part of my own story, which is I kind of fell into the digital media and social media space really early, right out of school, 2003. I had one of the first viral videos of me proposing to my wife, and things kind of escalated from there. And what I was really known for up until about 3 years ago was I was the digital and social guy. And so that's what brought me to my agency, 22 Squared, 11 years ago, and helped me become a partner. And what happened 3 years ago was I pivoted my currency to be one of kind of the digital and social media side, to being more of how can I be an empathetic leader and a true servant leader in everything that I do. And it was around that time that I inherited the most amazing group of 30 millennials. And I've always been surrounded by people younger than myself. And I was at an executive retreat with Tommy Breedlove, who I know introduced us, I think. And he said,
He did.
I didn't know Tommy, and I introduced myself at this executive retreat that he was running. I was like, I don't really know what I do anymore, but I'm kind of the millennial whisperer. And these guys are like, oh, wow, like, tell us more. And I told them some of the tactics I use, and they're like, I can't believe you do that stuff. And it was Tommy that said, hey, you better write that book, Chris, and if you don't do it, I will. And I didn't really know Tommy at the time. And I then, that planted a seed. And 3 weeks later, 4 of the 14 executives on this retreat, they were like, Chris, I started implementing some of the things you were talking about, and it works. And so, really it was in that moment that I went from becoming known as being known and my currency being this thing around digital and social media, to then being more of everything that I do now is about how can we build environments where empathy and connection can thrive. And so that's kind of what I've been, the journey since publishing about 14 months ago, of what I've been kind of doing. And what's cool is it's opened up doors with companies like Nike and others, where I create the relationship using that need. and then I bring in the agency alongside me for other stuff. So so far so good.
That's really cool. And so, when you talk about fostering empathy and stuff, right, that you're talking about building teams that are primarily, or at least a large portion of the team is made up of millennials.
Correct. I mean, and listen, it doesn't matter. One of my favorite quotes since publishing is millennials aren't the problem, they just expose all the problems. And so if you look at the need base, whether it be millennials, Gen Zs, or even Xers and boomers, when it comes down to it, everyone can agree that, yeah, we all kind of want these things, right? And, whether it be inspirational leadership, autonomy, or transparency, which are kind of the three main things that millennials statistically and Gen Zers are looking for from their leaders. And so what I found is using really these need bases and letting that act as a catalyst for the changes that need to happen. I mean, look at what's happening now. The number three thing behind from a workplace that millennials were wanting is work flexibility. And now for the first time ever, we're being forced into that with this pandemic. And a lot of people are finding it, I think, a little bit easier than probably what they anticipated, but they're being forced into it. And I think that will continue to carry on. And we can talk about more of that later. But
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually it's something, I'm like just barely outside the millennial range, on the older side, and I've always been a huge proponent of workplace flexibility. And I haven't even when I worked in corporate, I managed to score a work from home, work my own hours deal with them, because it was something that it was really just important to me. And if I was like, if you want my skills, you're taking them at a distance.
totally. And you can't untaste
um,
that, right? I mean, I think people are
yeah,
right now are finally getting the taste of what that is. And some might say, actually, I'm craving to be around people. Others, I think the truth will be somewhere in the middle where you have a kind of corporate environment where everyone gets together and does a rah-rah and brainstorms and does the teamwork and stuff, but then everyone kind of leaves out of it. I read a statistic recently, though, that 35% of all jobs have the ability to work remotely. And, so we're talking
yeah,
about predominantly white collar, corporate type gigs. So not everyone has that freedom, and I recognize that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can put into place to create this environment of empathy. And one of the things I emphasize is like rewards and recognition, right? Have those things in place, coupled with, constant feedback. Don't wait for someone's quarterly review to give them feedback. And the good, the bad, the ugly. And there's a art and a science to how we can deliver these things in a way that we can build people up versus take them down.
absolutely. So, do you find that those skills sort of translate cross culturally to organizations that have team members from U.S., Canada, U.K., Philippines, India, wherever they've got talent?
Sure, that's a great question. So I've worked with a handful of companies, Nike being one of them, and I led an executive kind of team building day, and we had people coming in from Korea, all over the world. We had representatives of every single continent. Well, not every continent, but all, everywhere from Asia, South America, etc. And it was astounding to me how much of the stuff that I was talking about struck a chord with them, regardless of what culture they were from. And I've also done some engagements with some other multinational companies. There are nuances to it, right? So there, some of the tactics and things are that I talk about, like especially this idea of like rewards and recognition and over communication, that doesn't translate directly to places like Germany, right? Like Germans are wired very differently and takes kind of a different set. But for the most part, these are all areas, regardless of culture, that people can agree upon. We all kind of want and need that. What's different is where their starting points might lie, right? So like, I mean, a culture
Yeah,
like German culture or, Indian culture or a handful of others, they're not necessarily as adept at that constant kind of optimistic view and that entrepreneurial mindset to a certain extent. So, yeah, there are nuances.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you just sort of have to adjust them to fit the culture. But human psychology is human psychology. And if I'm
Exactly.
understanding you correctly, you're talking
Eh,
about we're finally getting to a place in the workplace where it is looking to actually take care of the people instead of using the people like cogs in a machine.
Exactly. And deep down, as human beings, we all just want to be loved and accepted. And whether or not you care to admit that within your corporation is one thing, but I mean, it is the truth. And so, how can we create environments where people can feel that on a daily basis while also setting, and I think it's easy to go and talk about all the needs, but it's just as important to talk about, what are the places that these younger generations and even some of these cultures the younger people can learn from, right? Discipline and getting stuff done. And I have this saying, turn your let's into a by when, and saying let's do this, let's do that. You got to have accountability with then answering it with by when. And so what are some of those things, coupled with what has happened with kind of the onslaught of social media and what I call kind of this Pinterestation of a generation, where everyone has this idea in their head that the perfect job exists. And prior to all this pandemic stuff, people were competing so hard for talent that, um, you know, a lot of these younger, but whether it be Xers or Gen Zers, would jump around when they didn't have that 100% fit. And so some of the concepts I bring up, like my 70-30 rule, are that 30% of your job's just going to suck, right? So stop believing what your friends are telling you or what you're seeing in your feed. 30% of life is going to be tough and 30% of your job is going to suck. 70% should fuel you up and fire you up. And if that's not the case, I've talked to some corporations where on the panel of young people that I have up to bring some of this stuff to life, they're like, yeah, it's actually more 30-70 the other way. And I'm like, okay, I get that. You're earlier in your career. So it's up to that corporation, your boss, to help you fuel yourself, because that's not sustainable. So let's find out what are some of the side hustles or passion projects that they can help you pursue. And I tell everyone, you got to embrace people's side hustles, whether it be with 20% of time or just support or guidance. You got to allow people to thrive in that way. So once again, it's a two-sided kind of conversation that I try to elicit with this thing.
Absolutely. I love it. So my next question for you has to do with your origin story, right? So we talk all the time in this show. Every hero has their origin story. It's where you started to realize that you were different. Maybe you had superpowers and maybe you could use them to help other people. Where did you get started on this whole entrepreneurial journey yourself?
So I'm the youngest of six kids and an identical twin. And I'll tell people that I was a double mistake, right? My parents didn't want a fifth kid. And then I was like that freak anomaly as the second one. And all the way through, I was this ridiculously, and I was brought up in a British household where, I think our most famous saying was rise above it. Like, you don't talk about your feelings. But I was like this anomaly in every aspect of that, and struggling for my own identity, both in the face of twinhood, having an identical twin just like me, but also being the youngest of, what was, four siblings that were overachievers. And I was always striving to be different. So it's why, unlike my brothers and sister who went to Ivy League schools, I stayed in the South, and that's really where my path started to track its own. My identical twin brother stayed in the North and then became an educator. And so then I'm like, all right, I might as well just roll with this. And it actually took me 64 job interviews before I found my niche, which was, it's I'll tell people that it was through that process that I started to identify some of my own passion points and strengths, but it took a while of taking a lot of lateral moves before I could make it happen. And so I fell into this kind of digital and social media world in the early days. And, I got to work directly with Zuckerberg and some of these, now they are the beacon of entrepreneurship, right? They're these faces that I was very lucky enough to do some projects with. People will ask me like, oh, what was it like to hang out with Zuckerberg? And I'm like, okay, listen, I got to admit it. I only had dinner with him once and he didn't say one word all dinner. This is before he had gone through a lot of his development stuff. But being exposed to a lot of these startups from early on and watching them grow really instilled in me this yearning to do things differently. And I think also that coupled with being the youngest of 6 kids and an identical twin. And it just so happens that I married an identical twin. And
Oh,
so
that's
my
fun.
wife is an identical twin. I branded our wedding doublemintwedding.com, and there was a big PR play around that. And it just, once again, ridiculous things tend to happen when you start living and breathing what it is that you do. Passion, purpose, and profession. When all those things overlap, you don't know when you're working and when you're, and my wife hates it because she's like a very personal person, but uh, private person, not in that sense. So yeah, I would say that's really what instilled in me the entrepreneur kind of gene, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. So like just starting off with having to set yourself apart from siblings and a twin and whatnot. That's a interesting way to start life. That's for sure.
Sure, absolutely. And family systems theory, I don't know how much you look into the psychology of things. That's a real thing, right? And
Yeah.
I think a lot of, whether it be age order or our origins, do craft a lot of who we are and where we go.
Yeah, they say your siblings are responsible for like 80% of how you turn out, and your parents are only responsible for like 20. So,
That's so
with 6 older
fascinating.
siblings, I'm sure you had quite the impact. But yeah, we look at it a lot because we got 4 kids, and it's funny. Like my wife and I'm an oldest child, my wife's the youngest child, and you can see a lot of differences in the way we look at things just because of where we were in the family place growing up. So
Oh, 100%, 100%. And it's funny now that I have an identical twin wife. It's interesting too how much your partner molds you, because we've essentially had foils acting next to us, right? My twin and her twin, and you get to see through time how much, whether they recognize it or you recognize it, your choice of spouse ends up molding you into who you are.
yeah, absolutely does. My wife's made me a better person, so that's always good.
My wife has made me a much better person.
Shouldn't we all be so lucky, right?
Oh, dude, I think all relationships are getting tested to the nth degree. It was funny yesterday. My wife turned to me as we were kind of like winding down super late after getting the kids to bed. And she goes, "Are you sick of me yet?" After being quarantined at the house for whatever it's been, 6 weeks. And I was like, "No, not at all." I was like, "Are you sick of me?" She was like, "No, I'm not." I'm like, "All right, that's a pretty good sign."
Yeah, that's what my wife and I were talking about. That we're having a good time. We're enjoying our what do you call it? Our quarantine together.
The
Um,
quarantine of your life.
yeah, the quarantine of our life. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So my next question for you has to do with your superpowers, right? So every hero has their superpowers. This is what you do or build or offer this world that really helps solve problems for other people, right? The things you use to slay the world's villains. And the way I've been framing this for my guests lately has been, right, if you look at all of your skills, right, you might have a whole set of things that you've gotten really good at over the years. And if you really analyze them, you probably have one skill that really energizes or makes the rest of them possible, right? And that's your zone of genius or your superpower. What would you think that is for you?
So my personal purpose statement, which I came up with almost 5, 6 years ago, is to inspire and connect. And everything I do kind of filters through that. But if you were to then kind of take it down to just one superpower, it is somewhere in that of uh, I I I'm addicted to momentum, and I love catalyzing things. I love creating. I'm a builder, and I love working. I'm the biggest extrovert you'll ever meet. So I would say it's something around that inspiration, like to inspire and catalyze things without necessarily asking for anything in return. I just love meeting people, growing with people, and doing projects together. And, even in this book journey, the single greatest day in that was the second that I brought in my editor, Nick Pavlitas, as a partner in the whole thing, because I was finally not like that single player on it anymore. I'm like, oh, finally I got someone to go and talk to all the time. So, and part of that's probably because I've always had someone next to me as an identical twin. So I would say it's to really inspire and catalyze things is I get people fired up, and I'm also relentless in that. So it would be somewhere in there.
Awesome. And I like it. It seems like it's a very connection oriented skill, right? Where you can get people to connect with each other and step up to the plate and be part of be part of whatever it is that's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to authenticity too, right? I mean, Tommy will say that self-actualization happens when you're the same person in front of everyone. And for me, it's like what you see is what you get. And, that my driving force is really, it is that connection, striving for connection with others. And the book I'm working on now is all about how to be a more effective networker. Because I recognize that the pain points in the world have shifted with everything that's happened. And so many people get networking wrong, but really it's through interpersonal connection and relationships that everything else follows. And the title of the book I just came up with, it's called Save Your Asks. And, so many people will go in for that ask and it's way early in the relationship. You're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like even on LinkedIn, how many LinkedIn messages you get saying that people just
Connections,
want to be
every
on
one
your
of them you get.
podcast, right? Like people just want a connection out of you, or they want to be in your podcast. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, let's get there, right? I mean, how many people, 0.1% of people have actually even know that I wrote a book and I've sold almost 100,000 copies. It's like, come on, dude, just do a little research before and I'll be more than happy to connect and help out. But people just get it wrong. So you got to save your ask.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I closed 3 contracts this last week for our
Awesome.
agency, and every single one of them started with a give instead of an ask. And it's an interesting thing that a lot of people I don't think understand how powerful it is. Like, just as an example, one of the contracts we closed, the guy came to me and was like, hey, I've been working on this project for months. We had someone else doing it. It took us all this time and it's still not doing what we want. And I was like, I talked to him for a while and I was like, it's like in our zone of genius. And I was like, I can fix that for you this afternoon. And he was like, okay. And he was like, and he gave me I was like, just send me this details of whatever. And I asked him for all of it. And then, our team went to work and we fixed it by that afternoon. We put it all together and it was ready to go. And they made sales like starting the next day because the stuff we fixed. And he was like, what do I owe you for that? And I was like, first one's on the house.
Yeah.
Right. And he turns around and he was like, dude, you're a rock star. And now
Yeah.
we've got a retainer contract going on. And he's like, literally everyone in my entire organization and all of our audience needs what you have. He's like, that turns into huge business really quick.
I love that. But I love how you reference it as the give, right? And, sometimes it is, in one part of it, I talk about a race to the middle, which is so many people struggle with connections with others because all they talk about is business. Whereas with a little bit of research, you can figure out where that overlap with passions lie. It might be grilling. It might be kiteboarding. I started watching sports at one point because if they didn't have kids or I would run out of stuff. But when you start with that and then you start talking about business problems, and to your point, you do a little bit of the give and a test drive, and it's like the rest starts falling in place. But so many people do it the wrong way.
And you don't have to do any selling at all if you do it that way too.
Exactly. And it should never feel like selling. And the other thing people ask me is like, so what happens when you're courting someone and you don't like them? And I tell them, it's like, well, it's easy. You don't want them as a customer, so don't let them in, right? If you don't want to be friends with the person,
say no.
don't do business with them.
Oh man, that's hilarious. But yeah, it's the that whole idea of finding out where people are and what they're actually interested in and actually caring about them is such a powerful thing. Like I got to have dinner with one of my mentors because of that, right? The guy that I looked up to for a long time. He was speaking in front of, I don't know, a 5,000 person audience. And, he gets down off of the stage and there's like, the line of 1,000 people that, want to come and talk to the speaker afterwards. And he's doing the very cursory, like shake everyone's hand kind of thing. And I had known a bit about him on the other side. We had a connection that was completely outside of business. It had to do with one of his side passion projects. And so I stood in line patiently and walked through and I said, hey, I don't want to take any of your time, but I'm really interested in this side passion project. We've got the same story there. I'd love to talk more. And then I said, I'll talk to you later, and walked away before he even got to say anything. And it was funny because he was like watching me as I left. And he sought me out later, and invited me to dinner. He was like, I want to talk more about that with you. And so he invited me and my business partner to dinner and paid for like really nice steak dinner for us. And we got to chit chat about all these things in a room full of 5,000 people that would have loved to have him take him out to
Totally.
dinner because there was a connection outside of the business.
100%. And I mean, and it doesn't take that much effort to figure it out. And it's all around us, whether it be LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It's why I say from a connection standpoint, so much comes down to connection with humans, whether it be your employees or people that you might be doing business with, or, potential customers. It really is all about relationships and connection. And I'll tell everyone, first thing you got to do is follow your people on Instagram. They're like, I'm not following my these young kids on Instagram that work for me. That feels awkward. I was like, well, then you got to work in that relationship, because they're not going to stick around for you if they don't feel like there's some sort of real connection. And it's not for them to follow you. So don't worry about what you're posting. It's for you to take a vested interest in their life. So on Monday, you can start that conversation and say, Meg, that kitten you adopted is the cutest thing I've ever seen. Tell me more about it. And Meg's going to be all fired up, be like, oh my gosh, yeah, the kitten I adopted is, and it all starts with that stuff. So I love that example that you use with just understanding people's, passion projects and identifying on that, and then using that as kind of the entree into a real relationship.
Yeah, yeah, and we do the same thing with our team. I don't have a huge team. We got a pretty small team, but we're all over the world, and we use Slack to get together and chit chat for work. But we have a weekends channel, and we all post things like, our kids' birthday parties and other things, and we keep up on all that kind of stuff, right? And one of my the guy who's going to be editing this episode, one of my first employees, he'll probably see this and laugh about it. But he was just posting yesterday, because they're all into the COVID quarantines, that his working buddy for the day is his little 2-year-old nephew. And posted some pictures, and it was super cute, and we started chatting, and I showed him pictures of my quarantine buddy, who's my little 1-year-old, who keeps coming in here and like wanting hugs and to bring me all of her chewed up dog food that she found. So
What's his name?
but yeah, we got to have my little one is Zinnia, and it's a little girl.
I
Yeah,
love
and
it.
she's in love with the dog food. We can't keep her out of it. So she brought me 2 or 3 piles of dog food that she had chewed on this morning, and I was like,
awesome.
would you stop with the dog food?
That's awesome. Awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a crack up, because the dog, he's a big dog. He's a 70-pound poodle. And like, if the cat tries to steal his food, he growls at it and like shoos him away. But if the baby comes over to steal his food, he just steps out of the way and be like, you're above me in the pecking order. You can have whatever you want.
That's great. I love it.
So awesome. So my flip side question for you on the superpowers is your fatal flaw, right? So just like Superman has his kryptonite, most superheroes have their fatal flaw, something that's held you back in business, something you've had to work on. And I think more importantly than what it is how have you worked on that? So someone who's listening to this and might struggle with something similar can learn a bit from you. What would you say that is for you?
Patience. And I recognize it. It's funny. I have a full sleeve tattoo, all very significant. And I have 2 bands. Well, you kind of see. This is passion and perseverance, and then this is patience. And patience is bigger because I need more of it. And passion and perseverance, like, that comes easy to me. The flip side of that is the patience, making it happen, transitioning to letting it happen. I mean, this period now, and quarantine has been very challenging for me, because I'm addicted to momentum and progress and creating, and it's forced me to take some time. And so have I improved? A little. I think mindfulness and, the tactics that help me with that are no more than 3 things a day to accomplish in a day, because I'll try to take on the world. And then I think mindfulness and that constant reminder of trying to be where my feet are, as my friend Mark Hodelick says. And then I've made some improvement, but it is absolutely my fatal flaw.
So what's interesting about that is there's a lot of, I think, important things to unpack there. And one of the things that one of my early mentors said to me a number of times that really, really stuck with me, it took me a lot of years to like actually figure out what it meant, was that as human beings, we vastly overestimate what we can accomplish in a year and vastly underestimate what we can accomplish in 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. And his point, and the thing that I've sort of recognized from that, is we are impatient with results not realizing that it's a journey, right? And if you put in, like you said, a little bit of progress every day, when that snowballs over the course of 10 years, you can become a rock star in pretty much any space you want, right?
Yep.
But you have to put in the time, you have to put in the work.
Yep.
And the other thing too about choosing, like, you just have a couple of things, no more than 3 things a day, instead of, constantly trying to, what you said, make it happen, right? I remember a time in my career where I was putting in 12 and 18-hour days. And it wasn't until I stopped doing that I started seeing massive growth.
Sure.
And got to a point where, like, I rarely work more than 4 hours a day now. And it's just, I pick out a couple of things, I get those things accomplished, and I make sure I get something accomplished every day and push it forward. And it's skyrocketed. And
Yep.
it's a hard thing to, like, learn, because you feel like, if I haven't got there yet, I have to work more. I haven't earned the right to sleep yet. Right? And it's a dangerous place to be.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think your point with, just what focus brings to a lot of these things. And I talk about it in the Millennial Whisperer as what social media has done to a lot of us is everyone craves those Instagrammable moments, right? Champagne moments. It's being on top of the podium and spraying the champagne. And, the same thing is with a parent, right? Instead of taking in the time, like last night, reading Harry Potter with my 10-year-old and finishing up the first book, instead of having those as the big moments, you're craving them winning some award or whatever it is. And so it really is in the journey. And I'm actually really good at that side of it. It's that I'm 100% addicted to momentum. And even like with one of my coworkers yesterday, they had just gotten a big sale done. And I texted them, I was like, man, gosh, I could really use a win right now. And I just talked to him an hour and a half about a win that I didn't recognize. And he was like, what? Because it's been an hour and a half, Chris? I was like, oh my God. So I think recognizing wins, right? And one thing like they talk about with mindfulness is just talking about mindfulness is being mindful, because you are just, the process brings you into, being mindful, right? And that's a muscle, as Tommy will say. These are muscles that we have to be flexing every single day. And some are more natural than others, but I don't think I'll ever be described as a truly patient person, but that's also, it's, I think a yin to the yang of our own strengths and weaknesses, right?
Absolutely. But it helps to recognize where the weakness is and short up a little bit. So
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah. Especially if you've been using it as an excuse not to see your wins on a regular basis. That's hard to do on yourself if you're not recognizing the wins.
Well, what happens is I
them.
think you get conditioned to them, right? Because I mean, in the process of even what would have excited me in the first month after launching my book no longer excited me 7 months later, right? Because there's a tolerance that grows with, that momentum and adrenaline that I feel, and also why I'm not as patient is I want more of that excitement. And I'm like, come on, let's go. And, selling my first batch of 1,000 books, and then you're, whatever it was, to, 10 months later, we're at 100,000 books, and you sell 1,000 books. You're like, is that still a win? So it's tough, right? I mean, and look at what's happening around us. It's like the one time that you have true appreciation for health is the day that you come back from something, or, your right knee, when I busted my knee mountain biking. And then, as soon as I was able to run again, I was like, this is so amazing. And so there's a kind of back and forth with that tolerance that builds, and that you got to bring it back. And I think what's happening right now is, like, think about what would happen if all of a sudden we had a cure or a vaccine for this pandemic, and just
Everyone
how
would love
appreciative.
restaurants.
Totally. And everyone would go absolutely nuts. And then literally 6 weeks later, we'd be back to, I think, to a certain extent of where we were. And it's like, so what is that? How do we continually, like, I'm still, I am very fortunate. I still have a job, like I have my family who I love around me, and I've got to focus on that stuff. And there are wins in that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm digressing.
We have the same sort of thing happens with, raising children, right? Your toddler, every time they stand up and take a step, you're like celebrating them, but by the time they're 10 years old, if they fall over, you're like, why are you falling over? Right?
Totally.
Right, because you get conditioned, and it's interesting because I see that in my own parenting where I'm like, I've stopped recognizing my older children for things that would have been huge successes just a few years ago, and trying to realize, like, where's the balance in that? Because there's some things that you have expectations of as a human being that you should be doing, acting in certain ways, but then there's other stuff where it's like, hey, I want to make sure that we're still celebrating you as a person, right, and who you are and what you're becoming, and the work that you're putting into becoming who you are, right, that kind of stuff, raising your kids. And it's
Totally.
the same kind of thing. We do that with ourselves, and we get ourselves into places where it's like, stuff that was a win a couple of years ago, now we don't even recognize as being good.
100%.
Absolutely. So my next question for you has to do with your common enemy, and your common enemy is in regards to the clients that you bring on and you work with, right? Like a Nike or something like that. And if you had a magic wand and you could remove one thing from your client's life that would just dramatically increase the results they're getting with, in this case, their teams and their organization, what is that thing that you sort of like, you bang your head against the wall all the time trying to convince them that they need to, make this change or make this shift or whatever?
I would say my largest obstacle or barrier is the mentality of, well, I had to do it this way. Why don't they? And you see it with just professions. I ran into, right before we had the lockdown in Atlanta where I live, I ran into a good family friend of ours. His name's Sharuk, and he's got a big company, Iranian descent, and travels all over the place. And I was like, Sharuk, how you been? What's going on? And he was like, oh, I've been, really, traveling like crazy. He's 70 years old, so right in the boomer set. And he was like, yeah, I've been to Paris, I've been to whatever. I'm like, awesome, that sounds so cool. Like, tell me about it. He was like, oh no, it was for work. And as soon as you associate something with work to these older kind of generations, it's, oh, this is a drag that has to be, it can't be fun. And in that same realm, there's this idea of, like, I mean, work flexibility. Up until this pandemic, the biggest thing that I would go up against at these corporations was, well, I had to do it this way, why don't they? Why don't they have to sit at their desk from 8 until 5 all day every day? And so I think that is probably the greatest thing that we can help people get rid of. With, okay, the world is constantly changing and it's evolving faster than ever before, and we see it with technology, we see it with all of these things that are happening, the good and the bad. And so how can we help people adapt a little bit faster to, all right, yeah, let's try that.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because it's a bit of jealousy essentially that's coming in. And like, not to keep bringing it back to parenting, but I've realized the same thing with my son. I've been trying to tell him that he needs to learn to type, and he keeps telling me, like, Dad, I don't have to type. I have, like Siri and voice activation. And I'm like, go, when he asked me a question, I'm like, go look that up. And he pulls out the thing and he just talks to the phone. And like, that's not our first response. Our first response is to type because we had to learn to type. And I'm like, you need to learn to type, son. And he's like, no, I don't.
That is such a good example. I love that. That's
right.
perfect.
And it's funny because, like, he's actually probably in that generation where he's going to have to learn to type, right? We're not quite there. But just a few more years, it probably won't be that case, right? And it's going to be, it's just an interesting, like, solid example that anyone who's got kids in the 8 to 12-year-old range, they're probably dealing with that right now.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's also this idea that your work slash profession can't also be your passion. And I'll say that life needs to be a ruthless pursuit of passions. And it's through that process that, I'm not saying perfection, right? That it has to be all perfection, but that in the same way that things are easier in terms of technology, not having to learn these old school ways of typing and stuff, the same is also true in terms of opportunity. And there's almost too much opportunity. So, and that's kind of where I'm starting to head with this kind of networking and currency, and with this next book, which is how can we be spit out into this plinko game of life that's somewhere close to our innate passion and purpose. And the closer we are to that, the more fulfilled, as well as, I think, quote unquote, successful we will be in wherever we end up falling and evolving from. But where so many people get it wrong, and I see it with my friends, very well-to-do people, incredible, some well-known people, and they'll turn to me and they're like, I hate my job. And, it's like, well, why are you a lawyer? If this person's a lawyer or a partner at a firm, it's like, well, I just got into it because my dad was a lawyer. And it's like, well, what lights you up? And then we start talking about that, and it's on the way other side. And they're so far along this path that it's difficult for them to transition their currencies from being a lawyer to something new. Anyways, I digress, but.
Yeah, it's very true, right? And it's one of the things that I found interesting because, like, myself, I knew, like, really particularly what I wanted to do with my life and family, which is why, like I mentioned earlier, we're traveling in an RV with my kids, and we have been for 2.5 years. And I realized early on that, like, I hit a certain income level, and I was like, I don't really need any more money. I don't want it. Like, I mean, I wouldn't say no to it if you gave it to me. But, like, I've got all the things I want now, and what I want more than that is the time freedom to go and spend with my kids and everything. And I've had a couple of instances over the last couple of years where some of my clients who, some of them are extremely successful in their space, right? Like, I got one of the guys who's really, really successful in the wholesaling real estate space, and he does like $250,000 a month in profits, like, in his pocket.
Wow.
For his organization. And I'm like, that's just an insane amount of income. And he was like, you have more freedom than me because of how you chose to build your business.
Totally.
Right. And it's interesting because a lot of people don't think about what I call it, they don't think about the monster they're building. Right. And, when it comes to your life and everything, if you think about that ahead of time and really build your life around, like, hey, this is what I want, you have, to your point, a plethora of opportunities. You can custom design your life to be exactly what you want nowadays, right? Where that's something that our parents and grandparents didn't have that opportunity.
Well, and I think and I totally agree with all that, but the other thing is you got to do the work to get there too, right? And, I think people
Absolutely.
oftentimes in that journey towards that will give up too early. And it's like, listen, people will look at me and be like, Chris, you have a best-selling book. Like, of course you do. I'm like, do you have any idea the hell I went through to do that? Like, I took a $200,000 unsecured high-interest loan to help me achieve all these things, and I never stopped, and I still don't stop. And there is this, when people will ask me, like, what are the traits that you're trying to instill in your children, given the changing environments? And it's quick and to the point, and it's resilience and tenacity, and that is I think, two big traits.
Never give up.
Right? Yeah. I mean, and I think a lot of times people aren't willing to put in the work. Right? I mean, look at the fire festivals, and many people are looking for shortcuts where, in the same sense that things don't happen overnight, but our expectations, because the way that we get information is that, oh, it's like super quick, and it's not, right?
Yeah. Yeah. People look at me and they're like, oh, you're an overnight success. I'm like, yeah, you just didn't see the 10 years it took to get there.
Exactly.
And it's really interesting because we, I tell people regularly, I was like, there's no competition for real men, right? Or there's no competition for real women. And what I mean by that is someone who's willing to put the work in. There's no one who will compete with you, right? And I tell people all the time, I was like, you can't compete with me because I'll work you under a table, right?
Yeah.
Right. I will just straight up work you under a table. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's in my realm of possibility, I would destroy you at it, because I just know that about myself, that I would work until you dropped.
Yep.
And keep going. And that's sort of like, it's a prerequisite for being able to build the life that you want, is the ability to put in the effort it takes to do it. Right. And not, I don't know what the opposite side of that is, but maybe it's just expectations, but also laziness, other things.
Well, I think also in that hard work, people take that so literally. And, this is why, Gary Vee and I don't exactly align on everything that he says. But, you take that literally to, like, you got to work nonstop. And it's not that. It's about energy put in. And part of that energy
versus
put
output.
in is, exactly. And part of that is digging out of a hole when you get punched in the face 5 times. Right? That takes a lot more to bounce back from than 40 hour, whatever it is, 20-hour days.
Hmm. And it's like this same kind of thing where I tell people now regularly that that creativity thrives with limits. When you look at your day and you're like, when I first started and I was working, 12, 18-hour days, I had no limits on what I was doing. So it's just doing everything, and your work quality just sort of like drops over the day. And when you give yourself limits, like, hey, I'm only going to work and I'm only going to accomplish these 3 or these 6 things today, then you get a lot better work done. And I noticed when same kind of thing happened when we moved onto the road, where you're like, I'm sitting outside of Yosemite Valley, and I'm like, if I finish my work today, I get to go hike, right, and go like jump off waterfalls with my kids. You have limits on like how long you want to spend working, and you get a lot better, higher quality work out of yourself, essentially, when you when you give yourself solid limits towards what you're going to
Totally.
do.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah. So my next question for you is the opposite of your common enemy. So if the common enemy is the thing that you fight against, your driving force is the thing that you fight for, right? So just like Spider-Man fights to save New York, or Batman fights to save Gotham, or Google fights to index and categorize all the world's information, what is it that you guys fight for? Or you personally, what do you fight for with your organization?
Oh, I fight for. I would say that it's to create a place where everyone feels truly accepted and valued, um, while also being challenged along the way. And that's a tough balance to find. I call it autonomy within structure, right? And it's funny. My wife asked me 5 years. It was right after I became a partner at the firm, and she said, "How are you still there?" Because she knows I'm very entrepreneurial. I'm very ADD. I love creating things, and I had, but prior to that, bounced around quite a bit in different positions. And I said, I think it's pretty simple. Richard Ward, our CEO, he gives me a long enough leash to be entrepreneurial, but enough structure that I'm always becoming a better leader. And that's kind of autonomy within structure. And I hope that what I'm fighting for and against is both kind of that in a nutshell.
So just out of curiosity, do you sort of see that having a major ripple effect, in that once you get more and more people operating sort of at their highest and best, that we start seeing a lot of the problems we see in our world get solved because we have more minds coming to it operating at their highest and best?
Totally. Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, that's sort of where I was like, when you were saying that, I was like, that's what I kept seeing, is that what you're actually doing. Like that's a method that's going to lead to a lot of solutions when we start getting more people operating at the highest and best.
Exactly.
My next question for you is a little more on the practical side, right? We call this the hero's tool belt. Maybe you got a big magical hammer like Thor, or a bulletproof vest like your neighborhood police officer. I'm curious about some of the practical tools you use to really help people, make better organizations for their teams. And I'm not sure we have time to go through like your whole book, but maybe 1 or 2 things that are really practical that someone could walk away with if they've got, millennials in their workforce, that they could make some changes.
Yeah, so I talked a bit about it. Rewards and recognition. Create a rewards and recognition top down. So what are you putting into place where people, I use the Big Blue Rooster as the example, where there's this company, Domo, out in San Francisco. They give the salesperson of the month this big blue rooster that sits next to their desk. They don't give any cash bonuses or anything else. They just give away this rooster sits next to your desk. And so I will tell people from the top down, create a reward system that is something special that you can give to your employees, and also create a peer-to-peer solution for them to reward one another. I start our meetings with snaps where I will just actually give props before we get going. Instead of people talking about their current events or some status sheet, I'll say, hey, I'm just going to kick this off. And I want to say, Meg, you did a killer job to that presentation. Way to push yourself out of your comfort zone, blah, blah, blah. And then everyone goes and gives snaps. And then that goes on and everyone starts giving snaps to each other. And so rewards and recognition is, I think, a key component to both this connection as well as how people can be a little bit more inspirational. A simple tactic, statistically speaking, thinking also in that domain is that if anyone gets a compliment of some sort of um, job well done from a client or coworker, just forward that to the boss and the boss's boss and CC them on it and say props to Meg for killing it. Like, so there's simple things that we can do. So rewards and recognition is a big piece. And then the other side of it is also, I feel like creating a place where transparency can thrive. And most people misinterpret transparency to either be financial transparency or transparency as a realm of vulnerability, where you got to cry in front of your people. And it's like, it's not either one of those. What people want from transparency, they want context. So talk about all the things that are happening. Right now is a perfect case. Give them the facts. What's happening with your client base right now? Who's doing poorly and who might be susceptible to what's happening around us with the pandemic, and talk about the decisions and things that you're putting into place, because it's all about context that they want from transparency. Why are you making the decisions that you're making? And the more that you communicate those things while also being truthful about it and authentic, I think you'll find a huge return.
That's really interesting. I actually just had an experience with that yesterday. And, because we're in the, same boat everyone else is. We lost a couple of clients because of the COVID crisis. And, my staff, they had sent me some worried messages, like, how are we going to do? What's going on with this? And, I started just sort of talking about like what I was doing in terms of bringing in new clients and where we were going in the direction, and gave them a really good, idea of like what's going on and where we're going forward. And I got thank you messages back from all of them. Like, thank you for like letting us know what's going on. And, I feel a lot better, more secure and things like that. And that's I didn't do that with that intentionality.
Totally.
But it's good to know that that's like one of the things you should be doing, and helping keep your team sort of like, in the loop, so to speak, on the things that are important to them and their job security and their part in the company.
Totally.
That's cool. So I got a couple more questions for you. This one's pretty quick. Own personal heroes. Just like Frodo and Gandalf, or Luke had Obi-Wan, or Robert Kiyosaki had his rich dad. Who were some of your heroes? Were they real life mentors? Peers who were a couple of years ahead of you, and how important were they to what you've accomplished so far?
So Tommy probably referenced this in his, but I've got a group of guys that are kind of in a mastermind with me. Tommy's in it. Breedlove, my friend Hank McClarty, Mark Kodalik, Quincy Jones, a handful, not the Quincy Jones, a different Quincy Jones. But those guys are my accountability partners, as well as people that I go to for very practical advice versus my very emotional kind of advice that happens inside my head and heart. So I would put all of them up on that pedestal for ones that I admire and aspire to be, as well as the ones that hold me accountable and give back in the same way that I give them. So those are my heroes.
Yeah, I've got the same kind of thing going on. I've got we call it the Black Level Mastermind. It's a group of people that are pushing their own businesses forward, and sometimes I feel like I'm the seventh grader who's learning to swim, who's in with a bunch of high school water polo specialists in the water. But it's really cool to be in a room full of people
Totally.
who are pushing you to be a better version of yourself. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
So last question for you, your guiding principles. What are top 1 or 2 principles or actions that you put in place every single day that you sort of, you think contribute to your success and influence? Maybe something you wish you'd known when you started out on this journey?
Well, I mean, for me, it does come down to my purpose. And I think one, understanding doing the work to figure out what your purpose is, and then letting that act as that guiding light to everything you do. And, that for me is to inspire and connect. And then another key thing for me in terms of principles was changing my own metric of success, which used to be, whether I admitted it or not, beating my brothers at the game of life, which is a horrible metric of success. And I changed that to impact. I did not win. It drove me to my breakdown, which was actually one of the best things that's happened to me, because it forced me to really, reorient myself in everything that I do. And so my new metric is amount of impact made on a day. And impact and success should be judged on a daily basis, to kind of our earlier discussion,
Yeah.
versus on these kind of milestone moments. So when my head hits a pillow, did I have a successful day in that, did I have the impact that I intended? And most days I go to bed feeling very successful. So those are the kind of, I think, two main points.
I like that. I like the idea of judging your day about whether or not it was successful today. So I have
Yeah.
one last thing we do here on the show. It's called the Heroes Challenge. It's actually how you ended up on the show. Tommy invited you to come via the Heroes Challenge, and it's basically this: do you have someone in your life, in your network, that you think has a cool entrepreneurial story? Who are they? First names are fine, and why should they come share their story on our show with our audience?
Well, I felt like a big piece of both what we talked about and then also what the world needs is resilience. And I talked a little bit about my group of the Great Nine, which is, Tommy was who I think referred me. I would stick to that same, both of those things. And Hank McClarty, who's the founder of Gratis Capital, is one of the most resilient while also goal driven people I've ever met. He is who I would recommend.
Awesome. Well, we'll reach out later and see if we can get him on the show. One last thing, where can people find you, right? If they want to pick up a copy of the Millennial Whisperer, or if they want to bring you in to speak at their organization, where can they find you and have that discussion? And then more importantly, who are the right types of people to reach out and pick up that book, or to reach out and contact you?
For sure. So, I mean, anyone, whether it be small businesses, entrepreneurs to large corporations, I wrote the book with examples of all the way to Fortune 50. So it's applicable to everyone. Go to the millennial.com. That's everything is there. And actually, I just launched a quiz. So if you go to quiz.themillennialwhisperer.com, you can take my quiz to figure out what type of millennial leader you are, as well as where your strengths and weaknesses lie. I can be found on Instagram at Tuff, TUFF22, which is probably the fastest response. If you get in touch with me and have questions or want to just, connect, that is the best place for it.
Awesome. You heard him. So it's at themillennialwhisperer.com or at Chris or at Tuff22 on Instagram. If you want to reach out to him. Last thing, thank you so much for coming on the show, Chris. Really appreciate it. It's been a fun conversation. Do you have any final words of wisdom for our audience before I hit the stop record button here?
I think I sign all my books. The best is yet to come. I think a lot of us are going through some tough times, and we must choose light. And so surround yourselves with those that can help you find light. And I do truly believe that regardless of what we're going through, the best is yet to come.
Awesome. I agree with you on that. Best is yet to come. It's going to be a fun couple of years after we sort of get over this crisis. So thank you again so much for coming on, Chris. Appreciate it.
Totally.